If you enjoy these videos, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, it really goes a long way. And with that, let's get right into it. Okay, so jumping right into it, Juventus versus Chelsea in the Allianz Arena. Juventus typically set up in a 2-3 when they were playing out of the back. They had their centre-backs in Gamma and Salvi really wide to try and provide options for the goalkeeper, although they didn't use them typically, and even if they did, they were just going to do the same thing, which was kick it long. I have to be fair, there were a couple of times when they did actually use the CDM, young Pedersen, to actually play between the lines, but that was a lot later in the second half. To prevent Juventus having easy possession passing out of the back, you had Chelsea setting up in a 3-4-1-2, so you had Harder as that CAM, and then you had the two wide forwards in Kerr and Kirby splitting to go and put pressure on the centre-backs. Sometimes Boateng, the left-back for Juventus, would actually pop up in more of a centre midfield position, right around here, and she would almost place a CDM trying to help out young Pedersen. So part of the reason for why Juventus played a lot of these long balls was because of just how aggressive the wing-backs for Chelsea were. We had Cuthbert and Wrighton, technically wide midfielders or centre midfielders, and they were playing as the wing-backs, and if the fullbacks of Juventus, so we're thinking Lundorf or Boateng, received the ball from their centre-backs or goalkeeper, they were immediately pressed by the wing-backs of Chelsea. Whilst Juventus obviously have a very high calibre of player, they didn't want to risk passing out the back and being swamped by the Chelsea players, so instead they played over the press. Later on, they were able to bring on Staskova, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and she was very useful for playing over the press of Chelsea later on in the game, where Juventus were really just trying to get a point out of the game. But instead at this point, earlier in the game, we have Girelli as the centre forward, but she often dropped and floated around, so maybe a little bit of a false nine. And then flanking either side of her, we had Hurtig, and then on the other side we had Bonensea, and both of these were really willing runners trying to constantly get in behind. I do want to just quickly go back to Boateng, the left back. On occasion, when they did try and play through the thirds, and they were able to kind of have momentum of the move just because they were able to beat the Chelsea 3-4-1-2 press, then she would actually try and drive into more of a central, almost number 10 or number 8 kind of position. I really enjoyed her movement this game. I think it's good to emphasise that Juventus did both play short and long goal kicks. Manin was very happy to hold onto the ball as the Chelsea forwards wouldn't necessarily press her. On one occasion, she almost paid for this where she smacked the ball against Kerr and it just went wide. With those long goal kicks, on occasion, you'd have Millie Bright push into centre midfield and just kind of bolster it. You've got Leopolds in there, who's obviously got a bit of high and aerial ability, but G, being her partner in there, was going to struggle against the like of Girelli, Bonensea, Rosucci, and Ternoia. So the two wide centre midfielders for Juventus actually did try and support whenever they could. So you would potentially have a problem there if Juventus played the ball over the Chelsea press. Another problem that Chelsea had all night was Hurtig. She just was a really willing runner, and because of the way that Chelsea pressed, specifically how aggressive their two wing backs were, it meant that quite often you would have a situation where a wide centre back who wasn't really comfortable in a one-on-one foot race would end up in one. So in this case we have that with Millie Bright, who's going up against one of the stronger runners in the Juventus side. So Millie Bright and Eriksson are covered by Jess Carter, who's quite quick, but it did cause there to be quite a few hairy situations for Chelsea at the back. Later in the game, Juventus had a lot easier of a time passing out of the back with short goal kicks and just progressing it through the thirds, mostly due to Chelsea kind of dropping off their press. They did change the shape of their press to a little bit more of a 4-2-3-1 once they made quite a number of substitutions, but really I'd say it's more a case of Chelsea just wanting to batten down the hatches more than Juventus being better able to elude Chelsea's press. So I do want to just make a quick point on the Chelsea 3-4-1-2 press. I believe that having one of the wide centre-backs, particularly Millie Bright, for this point, pushing into centre midfield to try and bolster the centre midfield for the aerial duels, as well as also tracking on occasion Girelli when she dropped, did cause problems for the Chelsea back line and actually did create space for Hurtig's runs. Another avenue of attack for Juventus that I thought worked quite well were their throw-ins. So setting up for the throw-in, Chelsea's centre midfielders typically bunched up towards the near side wherever the ball was being thrown from, and then they just left acres and acres of space on the far side. Of course, they're trying to compress the space, but on many occasions Juventus were able to just hoist the ball over the centre midfield of Chelsea, and they were able to really get into that space and get up ahead of steam and and get quite high and advanced into Chelsea's half. So I picked this play, one, because of the throw-in, and I thought it was a really good example of that, but then also two, because it showed what kind of situations Juventus were trying to create. So in this case, we have Boateng, the left back, pushing up. So as I mentioned earlier, if there was momentum to the Juventus attack, she actually wants to finish here somewhere, almost like a number 8 or a number 10. You're going to have Hurtig, who wants to try and exploit the space in behind the aggressively positioned wing-backs of Chelsea, who wanted to go and press towards the fullbacks of Juventus. Another aspect of this attack that I think was really characteristic of the way that Juventus played was the roles that their wide centre midfielders had. So yes, you have your wide midfielder on the other side in Bonansea coming narrow, but then you also have your wide centre midfielder pushing up into almost a wide midfielder role and free to try and exploit that far side. So this was something that both Sonoya, please forgive me if that's incorrect, and Rasucci did throughout the game. And then finally you've got balls in behind. So we already mentioned it with the wide midfielders of Juventus trying to get in behind, but we also had attacking runs of the wide centre midfielders into the spaces behind, trying to exploit or isolate up against the slower wide centre-backs of Chelsea. And of course take advantage of Chelsea's formation when it drops into the more defensively minded 5-2-3. So I would say that Juventus were playing a 3-2-5 in possession. Often they did play quite direct and play these kind of long raking balls as seen in the picture to the back post. So I did find it at times difficult to be able to tell exactly what kind of formation they were going for, but it did look like Boateng was trying to move into almost like a left CDM position, and then you would have the right back in Lundo stay as like a right-sided centre-back and not really advance as much. I just give the team a little bit of balance, whilst you'd have young Pedersen as the anchor, but with a lot more license for Rasucci and Sonoya, specifically Sonoya, the left-sided centre midfielder, to push up high with Girelli floating. Again, this tactic of floating the ball, whipping the ball to the back post, I think just takes advantage of the aggressive position of the wing-backs of Chelsea. So they're going to really have to bust a gut if they want to be able to recover and get into a defensively solid position to be able to header away the cross. But also there are quite a few examples of Chelsea kind of being a little bit suspect when it came to whipped crosses. So think back to last season with Wolfsburg. So it's a defensive pain point for Chelsea. So earlier we mentioned Juventus mixing up at the back, sometimes playing short, sometimes playing it long, and that there was, I thought, a little bit of a weakness to exploit with the fact that Chelsea's wide centre-backs would track forwards that dropped, especially when Girelli dropped, and she tended to do it, I thought, on Juventus's left-hand side, Chelsea's right-hand side, which forced Bright into a position higher up the pitch, and of course means behind her there's going to be space. And on this occasion, Juventus are able to play into young Pedersen, and she's able to find a little pocket of space where G is maybe a couple of yards further than she should be, although that could just be hindsight bias in that she was clearly trying to put a little bit of pressure here, and young Pedersen's movement kind of caught her unawares and allowed Juventus to play through the thirds and take advantage of Millie Bright's position to then play in Hurtig. Okay, so later on in the game, Juventus are really pushing to try and get all the points. This is going to be a really close group just because of the way that it played out in the first fixture for Chelsea. So obviously they just got a draw against Wolfsburg. So a draw in this game really wouldn't do anything for Chelsea, and then also to a certain degree would kind of hurt Juventus as well, because they played against potentially the weaker team in the group in Servette. So they really need to try and get these points where they can. And playing at home is probably one of the best places to try that. So Juventus were trying a 3-1-6 or a 3-1-3-3, whichever you prefer. In the back three, eventually we have Salvi get replaced by Lenzini. In possession, Boateng moves from her left back position into more like a proper number 8. You still have young Pedersen anchoring your centre midfield, at least until she's eventually kind of forced off by, I think it was a hamstring injury. And Juventus play Caruso and Bonfantini on the right. With these substitutions and changing formation, Juventus really tried to play through the thirds and just kind of cut through Chelsea's defensive lines with smart zipped balls from the back three into the front 6 or midfield 3 and front 3. where passes the feet weren't possible, they were also able to use Staskova's height when she eventually was substituted on. This being a really good example where you have Girelli dropping off the line, playing a false 9 role, and you have Gamma, the central centre-back in this shape, in this formation, fire the ball through the midfield line of Chelsea and into the feet of her striker, eventually forcing Chelsea to retreat and Juventus to be able to play the ball out to the wide spaces. At this point in the game, we've got Lenzini on at left-sided centre-back in this shape, and she's going to fire a ball into Hurtig, who's still sitting out in that wide space and just being really, really threatening. You've got your wide centre midfield in Sornoya. Just as we mentioned earlier in the game, she pushed high, and we've got Staskova dropping a little bit deeper in case they want to try and use her as a focal point. At this point in the game, Chelsea have moved to a 4-2-3-1. You've got two centre defensive midfielders in Leopolds and Ingle, supported by the hardworking Fleming as kind of the CAM. You substituted G at this point for solidity. Again, you've got the aggressive run in behind Hurtig. You've got Boateng, technically the left back, but actually playing again here more as, I'd say, a left-sided centre midfielder, trying to create real problems for the Chelsea midfield. Of course, this wouldn't be a Chelsea game without counters, and there were many of them. Moving on to Chelsea's deep build-up. So Chelsea typically built up in a 3-4, where their centre midfielders is G and Leopold centrally, and the width being provided by their two wing-backs in Wrighton and Cuthbert, often having Harder dropping from her CAM position to more of like a third centre midfielder, kind of off to the side of whatever defensive shape Juventus were in, which was typically a 4-3-3, although on occasion I would call it a 4-2-4, just because Sornoya would actually not stay quite as deep, and she would push up almost into like a second centre forward position. They did this when they were just trying to harry the centre midfielders of G and Leopold a little bit, when, for example, Chelsea were forced into a pass back after they've gone up one of the channels, so we're thinking towards maybe right-hand side or towards Cuthbert's side. As well as Harder dropping to try and link play, you also sometimes saw that with Kirby as well, who would drop. In this occasion, we've actually seen it here with Kerr, but more typically I'd say Kerr was the one who was holding the line, and it was Kirby who was dropping and also providing an option in the wide spaces, so that when Juventus's fullbacks, Lundorf and Boateng, went to go and press aggressively on the wing-backs of Chelsea, then there was someone there in Harder or Kirby to try and exploit that space. Chelsea changed their deep build-up to a 2-4 or a 4-1 later in the game once they were winning. Initially in the 2-4, you still had Leopolds and G, but then eventually it's going to be just Ingle. Juventus typically tried to press towards the side that the ball looked like it was going towards. So initially it looked like the ball was going to go out here towards Carter, who was now a right back in this back four rather than a back five. So you had the Juventus players all going across to that side, but then obviously Chelsea see that, anticipate that, and allow Juventus to shift to that side, knowing that now there's going to be space on Chelsea's left-hand side to try and advance. So the next stage of this 2-4 build-up by Chelsea, I do think it's important to emphasise that at this point Juventus are actually pressing actively, whereas in the first half they would have just dropped to the halfway line and pretty much engaged within 5 yards or so of the halfway line. We now have Bonansea and Hurtig very much advanced in the press. Further to that point, actually, it's difficult to tell whether Juventus's press was better or it was just a case of risk management by Chelsea, but a lot more often in the second half, in that last 20 minutes or so, with the more increased intensity of Juventus press, Chelsea did just kick it long and look for Kerr to maybe get in behind on something. At this point they were obviously winning, so they don't really need to build up through the thirds. In the first half, as well as maybe the first 15 minutes or so of the second half, before Chelsea scored, they had a lot of possession and they typically set up in a 3-2-4-1 whilst in that possession. So we have your three centre backs, you have your two centre midfielders. They did kind of oscillate in movement, so Leopold often tried to push a little bit higher, a bit further into the Juventus half to try and drag the centre midfielders away from G. So you'd often have Kerr as the focal point, with Juventus typically compressing the space on whichever channel that Chelsea decided to pass towards. So for example, let's say they went out towards Cuthbert's side on this right hand side, then Juventus would come across. So you'd have Hurtig, the left winger, come across, and then on the far side, Bonacea, the right winger, would push up and advance a little bit high. So she's almost like a right forward, just to make it difficult for Chelsea to be able to pass to any of the short options. To try and take advantage of this positioning, Chelsea tried switches to try and get their wing backs in possession, high up the pitch in Juventus's half. Juventus's fullbacks were tasked with pressing. Chelsea's wing backs whenever this happened, so immediately they would try and rush out. You can see here that Lundorf is ready to rush out to Reiten, and once she rushes out, then there's going to be a big space vacated here. We have to give a lot of kudos to Gamma, Salvai, as well as Rasucci and Sonoya, who were constantly covering for their fullbacks. So this is an example where Lundorf has just went to go and press Reiten, and now the space that she's vacated for the likes of Harder to try and exploit. But Rasucci has already tried to cover across, and she's going to track the run of Harder when she tries to exploit that space. Again, we have a fullback of Juventus brought in here, trying to press the Chelsea forward, leaving space in behind her, but helped out by her centre midfielders and centre backs to just cover that space, cover those runs. Part of the reason why I think Chelsea was so good at keeping possession in that first 60 minutes or so of the game was their counter pressing. So in this occasion, Chelsea were trying to build up on that left hand side. They're losing the ball, and Leopold is immediately trying to press against Bonacea. And of course, she's supported by the rest of her teammates as well. Because of that intensity and Chelsea's ability to regain the ball, I would say that a lot of Juventus's attempted counters fell flat. Okay, so this is another good example of Chelsea trying to build up in the channel. We've got Botin, who wants to try and press the wing back of Chelsea. We've got Bonacea, who's the far-sided wide midfielder, and she's pushed inside to almost a right forward position. We've got young Pedersen, who's trying to cover for her fullback, who's about to try and press. Also, we've got Chi, who throughout the game would initially start a little bit deeper as like a deep playmaker, but as the play progressed, and as we see here, she would try and progress with the play. So before the substitution to take off Chi and have Ingle as the CDM, Chelsea was still trying to play a little bit, and they set up in, I would call it a 2-3-5, where you had Fleming and Harder playing as the number 8. You've got Chi as the deep line playmaker, and you have your two number 8s trying to exploit the space in behind the fullbacks when they rush out to try and press the forwards in this case, rather than the wing backs of Chelsea. This was a really great game. If you enjoyed this analysis, please don't forget to leave us a thumbs up. And with that, we're out.